You can hear me? Excellent. Good. This is a little bit touchy. There we go. And thank you for recording it. That would be great. People are still filing in. There'll just be just a very few minutes. How is this mic? Can people hear me? I think.
Yep. Yep. How come my face isn't there?
Because you don't have the video.
Hmm?
Because you've got the video shut off. If you want to see your face, you have there. There you are. There's
Here
the
I
top of
am.
your head.
There you are. Here we are.
Somebody's saying something in the chat there.
Yeah.
There's lots of background.
Yeah, I think the background noise will dissipate as soon as people settle in.
People should mute that. Deal with a lot of the background noise.
Okay, everybody. How is my audio here? People can hear me at the back? Very good. Okay, well, welcome everybody. It's really nice to see people in the flesh again. My name is Ellen Schwartzel and I'm your moderator today. I'm also a member of the Toronto Field Naturalists lecture team, and for the next 6 weeks or so, I'm the current president as well. Let's begin by acknowledging the land and the people of the land. The Toronto Field Naturalists acknowledge this land through which we walk. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississauga of the Credit River. Today, it is still the home to many Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to be on this land. So I'm happy to welcome all guests joining us today. And in fact, I hope that you'll come again and become members of the Toronto Field Naturalists. The full range of membership benefits includes a terrific newsletter that comes out 8 times a year. We have many guided walks all over the city and all through the year. And of course, we have a whole series of lectures. And thanks very much to the whole lecture team for organizing today's event, and especially to Cameron So for connecting us to our terrific speaker, who I'll introduce in just a few minutes. A huge thank you also to Zunaid Khan and Sofia Mihailova. Their tech skills are absolutely vital to making this event possible. This is our first hybrid lecture, and after 2 years of Zoom events, there are bound to be a few gremlins. We hope it'll all work smoothly, but bear with us, please. After the talk, we'll have a Q&A session, and you'll also want to stay for your chance to win a copy of An Enduring Wilderness, a book of splendid Toronto photography by Robert Burley. And I understand that there are also 2 bee-focused books that we will raffle off, so that's even more exciting. So now I'm really delighted to be introducing today's speaker. Professor Scott MacIvor is a community ecologist and assistant professor in the Department of Biological Sciences at the University of Toronto, Scarborough. His research aims to understand biodiversity changes in urban areas to support conservation, to connect people to nature, and to improve the importance of green infrastructure, the performance of it, that is, such as green roofs especially, and urban meadows. His lab works mainly with insect-plant interactions, biological invasions, wild bees, and pollination services. So Scott, it's wonderful to have you here. And Zunaid, I think, just needs to.
Thank you so much. Zunaid, you're gonna get this. Yep. Get you fired up. I'm gonna go full screen. Okay. Oh, this mouse is so sensitive. Holy smokes. I can barely get it to the. There we go. That's one part. Now, let's see if I can close this. I won't be able to see everybody's Zoom screen, so I'll just say bye to you now. Okay. Oh, it
You don't
is.
really need to talk right
I'm
now.
just gonna chuck that down here. Okay, that should be fine. Everyone can hear me okay? Just for pronunciation purposes, I will take my mask off for the duration of the talk. Okay, so thank you all very much for attending this lecture series on a Sunday afternoon. As you just heard, thank you so much for the introduction. My name is Scott MacIvor, and I'm at the University of Toronto Scarborough. And today I'm going to be talking to all of you a little bit about native bee conservation and diversity in the city of Toronto, where we do the majority of our work. I kept it pretty loose and free form in terms of the content, but as you heard, we are focused mostly on plant pollinator interactions and particularly bees. And so I've taken the opportunity to speak to you today on new things we're doing now. And we have a nice big lab of now 6 PhD students, 2 postdocs, a couple master's students as well, and a bunch of undergrads. So we provide lots of opportunities for students to engage in research that are in our goal, applying this work to how the city plans green spaces, creates policy, and engages people to nature, as you've heard. So just briefly, we are the Bugs Lab, Biodiversity of Urban Green Spaces, and we like to think of biodiversity in 2 main ways. One, biodiversity supporting ecosystem services in a growing city, in terms of how effective it is at mitigating the effects of invasive species. So thinking about invasibility of our landscapes and the role of biodiversity in mitigating those properties. As we are a growing city of many people entering, and as the city expands, there's real opportunities to engage people in supporting biodiversity. Many of the work that we do, again, focuses on pollinators. And in this era of eco-anxiety and what do I do, supporting pollinators by planting a garden is a really effective and meaningful thing that an individual can do. So we work with the city on this Pollinate TO community grants, which the grants actually open tomorrow. And individual groups and community members can apply for $5,000 grants to plant pollinator gardens in schools, parks, churches, wherever they can be created. And of course, we think of the impacts that a growing city has on biodiversity in terms of biodiversity declines. How can we monitor biodiversity to see these shifts and changes through time? And again, yeah, we're a lab out in UTSC. So a big part of the work that we do as well is in conservation and outreach. So we like to think of bees as being charismatic mini fauna, many different species, many different shapes and sizes, times of year. Visiting lots of flowers and participating in these important interactions, connecting to ecosystem services. And they provide that like meaningful palette upon which we can, again, connect people to nature. And one of the other ways we do that is through design and urban planning. And this is just a few examples of bee hotels, trap nests, nest boxes that we use periodically in our research through the years. And we'll talk about some of that research findings today. These, of course, support cavity nesting bees, those that nest above the ground, many different species in Toronto, as well as cavity nesting wasps, which also play an important role in pest control, which I won't get into in this talk in too much detail. Just watch my time. So let's get to it. I mean, what inspires us about bees, of course, is they're important pollinators. And what inspired me to study bees as someone who grew up in a city is, wow, I can see like 40, 50, 60 species or more, even in a back or front yard or in a local park, right? They're very diverse. And in Toronto, we've identified over 300 plus species of bee. Of course, those being extremely effective pollinators. Bees have branched hairs, hairs on hairs, almost like with Christmas trees all over our arms. Of course, they're charged differently than pollen, and many bees can sonicate or buzz at a frequency that communicates with the flowers that they have evolved a mutualism with. So many different reasons why bees have evolved to be the best pollinators, and therefore also really important ones to watch and monitor. Of course, also many of us appreciate all the colors, shapes, sizes, diversity of flowering plants that we appreciate and grow in our city and elsewhere. And many of these, well, we can thank bees for that because this co-evolved relationship has led to this great deal of speciation that we see around the world. Now these interactions, right? Think of bees in green and these orange squares as flowers. These interactions are a really important way to characterize the health, stability, resilience of a particular community or environment. We can use this information as like an indicator of success and how well our restoration projects in the city are going. So all of this network jumbling in between here, that's indicating, overlap in resource use and redundancy, right? As individual bees disappear, one would expect flowers begin to disappear because the main pollinators that they depend on are gone. However, when we have this redundancy built in, we have insurance, right? For those changes that may be temporary because again, humans modify the landscape. We can plant more flowers to bring those bees back. Now, what are those bees? Again, this naturalist group, so I don't go too much into quirky facts in biology. I want to get into some of the science we're doing. But I will say that many of the bees that we appreciate in the city of Toronto actually nest in the ground, right? They're nesting either in cavities they excavate themselves, or they're looking for cavities that already exist. So these are some bees, sweat bees, that dig down themselves. They like, non-compacted, open, bare spaces. But again, with 300 plus species in Toronto and 75% of them nesting in the ground, many of these bees, we actually don't even know where they nest or what conditions they do prefer, right? So some of the heterogeneity that exists across the city might actually be supporting different kinds of bees in different kinds of areas. But lots and lots of work needs to be done to understand that kind of below ground infrastructure, that architecture they create, and how riprap, construction debris, tilling, compaction, drought, all these factors could influence where and how these bees nest. And for many of you who've seen like an aggregation of nests, like in Hyde Park or something, some of these may have been there for decades and decades, right? Because they tend to go to where they know it will work, right? So they're looking for each other. Other bees, of course, though, nest really apart. They're not as aggregating as some of those kinds of bees are. There's many ground nesting bees that are like that, as well as cavity nesting bees. So if 75% or so of bees in Toronto nest below the ground, the rest-ish nest above ground, right? So they're nesting in beetle bored holes in wood. Think of the beetles as creating the apartments and the bees are the next tenants down the road. Of course, many bees nest in pithy stems like elderberry or sumac. Others will prefer hollowed stems, like many of the perennial plants we find in our gardens. And really they're looking for those cavities where they can build a nest from front to, or from back. They go to the back of the nest to the front, lay their eggs in a sequence. And that sequence follows where females are laid in the back of the nest and males are laid in the front. And this is for one reason to protect the females from raccoons and woodpeckers and other creatures that might bite away at this juicy bit of protein. But also because males emerge first and they need to watch for females that emerge next so that they can mate with them and then die. And then the females go on and become pollinators in the next season. So of course, bees are important, they're pollinators, but in fact, actually their diversity matters for crop yield, right? So this is just two examples of blueberries and pumpkins illustrating that the seed set, which can be seen as like a proxy for crop yield, increases when more different individual bee species touch those flowers. So if I'm a pumpkin flower and I'm open for a day, right, very short time, and I'm completely pollinator dependent, if I have 10 visitors that day, I don't want all 10 to be the same species. I want different species potentially visiting my flower because they're touching the flower, depositing on that flower in different ways. That can accumulate the sufficient number of pollen grains that need to be transferred so that I can set fruit. But wild bees are threatened. They're threatened around the whole world. And in fact, a recent study in One Earth showed that globally 25% of wild bee species haven't been recorded since the 1990s. Some of these common groups like sweat bees that are very diverse, definitely over 80 species or more in Toronto alone, have declined by 17%, but records for rarer groups like oil collecting bees, like those that visit Lysomachia flowers, loosestrife, have decreased by upwards of 41%. Now, these data are based on GBIF, so like global biodiversity records that are aggregated by collections, by iNaturalist and so forth, but nevertheless, it's pretty scary to see the lack of frequency by which we don't encounter some of these bee groups. So what it's showing is uncommon species are becoming more rare and rare species are becoming extinct. And so we've seen this locally with Bombus affinis, the rusty patch bumblebee, which is extirpated from this region. It's still found in the US, but not here. The next one we're watching for and studying in the lab with Wildlife Preservation Canada is Bombus terricola, the yellow-banded bumblebee, which is seeing significant declines all throughout its range. Now, not all wild bees are not managed bees, right? So these are bees that are existing without our contribution necessarily. I mean, we garden, we plant flowers, we support them, but we're not managing their reproductive strategy or their nesting locations and so forth. So there are managed solitary bees like many mason bee species in agriculture, but wild bees are also not honeybees, which are a very common bee that we find in Toronto. So here's some former colonies up at UTSC where honeybees are kept. Of course, honeybees are social, unlike most wild bees that are solitary. They provision, the queen lays all of the offspring, the workers collect all of the food, and the drones maintain the colony and do a few other tasks. But this can amount to 20, 30,000 plus mouths to feed, right? So that has important context for what kind of bee species are we trying to conserve or promote in a place like a city or a natural area. I mean, honeybees are essential in places like this. When I get my almond milk in the morning, I'm dependent on honeybees pollinating these massive, massive acreages of almonds in California. Similarly, we have many industrial agricultural complexes, and honeybees play a credible, amazing, important role in these systems. In a city, though, that may not be as important because, as it turns out, there are many flowering plant species that honeybees visit that are also visited by native bees, and these can be points of competition. When you have 20, 30,000 mouths to feed, that quickly can deplete some of the resources that are available for all those solitary bees, those individual females, their own queens, making their own nests, living their own individual life. Now, this is a graph from a former postdoc of James Thompson here at University of Toronto. James Hung was able to show that, as you can see, there's a number of flower species that are proportionally visited by Apis mellifera, honeybees more. But there's a bunch of flowers that honeybees don't really visit that much at all. If we look at plant pollinator networks across the whole world, which is what this graph is from. This indicates to me something positive, right? If we want to support wild bees, well, what are those plants that honeybees are not visiting? Also, if we want to study competition between honeybees and wild bees, well, what are the plants that they are visiting? Because those could be the places where we start to do that research. Now, we in the lab have also come up with this concept of the management to invasion continuum, where we manage bees, they escape, and then they become invasive. So they're moving without the human intervention, and they're replacing native bee species. So there's a number of factors that can lead to that. Honeybees fit along that management to invasion continuum. And as I'll show in a few slides, we have 2 brand new bee species to Canada that we found in the lab that fit this bill too. They were originally brought to the US as managed pollinators for apples and cherries, and now they've spread, and they themselves are moving pests and pathogens, or can compete for nesting resources. So things that we're thinking about in the lab. But let's move to the crux of the talk today, which is focusing on the city of Toronto and cities more generally. And there are many studies that have shown that urbanization as a land use change, right, has a negative impact on biodiversity, right? Pavement, compaction, built infrastructure, altering that land is a key sign of, the Anthropocene, or this human modified environment. And as I illustrate in this graphic here, that along this urbanization gradient, which reflects this land use change, we might expect that cities would be a stressor for bees because the resources, nesting, floral, et cetera, that bees depend on may be less and less available in these environments. Maybe these environments are more fragmented and include land use type that have 0 habitat value or negative. It's actually problematic for them. But, others have started to argue that, bees being highly mobile, flowers and gardening being an important criteria for those living in urban environments who want to connect to nature. And a myriad of other factors might make cities potentially a refuge for bees. I mean, go the other way along that urban gradient, especially in an area like Southern Ontario. We're talking massive agricultural landscapes, corn, wheat, soy. I mean, we've heard a lot about pesticides and other problems for bees in agricultural landscapes. And so it could be the case that cities, given the diversity of flowering plants, the engagement of individuals to do something and so forth, may make cities a refuge. Now, we've seen some really weird stuff over the years studying bees in the city of Toronto. This is just a few to tantalize you as I move through this lecture. At the top figure, what we see is a leafcutter bee nest where the leafcutter bee has used plastic shopping bags to make its nest. And on the bottom figure, what we have is a resin bee, one of the most common cavity nesting native bees in Toronto, Megachile campanula, which collects pine sap to make its nest. We see it here using window caulking. So, I mean, are these aberrant behaviors? Are these mistakes? Or is this telling us something a little more about the inherent flexibility and ways in which bees perceive habitat in our environment? Here are just two other silly examples of a native mason bee species nesting in a metal tire rim and a leafcutter bee species. This is certainly a native one, although we can't identify it. We often have to look at their mandibles. Nesting in a metal armchair. Now, again, I ask, like, is this erroneous? Is this a bad idea? Is that metal armchair going to heat up in the summer sun and fry those baby bees? This is interesting stuff to us in lab. So let's turn our attention to Toronto. Now, Toronto being one of the most populated cities in North America, North and Central America, it's also considered to be one of the greenest among the large cities. And you can tell from the Rouge Park in the far northeast to Tommy Thompson and all of the ravines, there's much green space captured here, much of which is mostly contiguous and could be one reason why in Toronto, some of us advocate that cities could in fact be a refuge for wild bees. I mean, we found a brand new bee species to science back several years ago. Our former PhD student Lawrence Packer's lab, Jason Gibbs, found a new bee species, he often regaled as coming from right downtown. And other examples of ways in which people are interested in and thinking about bees in the context of art, in public space, engagement, and again, connecting people to the wild, interesting nature we have all around us. And this has led to other important ways in which this kind of bottom-up bubbling of interest in bees and pollinators and biodiversity has led to top-down engagement to kind of meet people where they are and also provide tools and resources and guides for people, practitioners, city departments, and so forth to try to strategize and make a habitat more suited to pollinators and people. Here is one example. This is our Bees of Toronto book, in which we have a checklist of all the bees of Toronto. We have recently passed in 2019 unanimously by City Council at the time, the Toronto Pollinator Protection Strategy, which creates rules and guides and so forth for those managing our parks, and of course, resources for things like Live Green Toronto to create that Pollinate TO community grants program. So lots of good stuff there. And let's set the stage even a little broader here. This is work that's coming out soon. We call it the Great Urban Shift. It's very hard to see, but I will explain it very, very briefly. What we did is we took iNaturalist data for over 1,800 different species in 50 cities across North America, the most populated ones. And what this is showing, without going into great detail, is we apply different climate change scenarios to model what the predicted number of species that will be lost from cities and number of species that will be gained in cities because of this changing climate. Now, what got us excited about this project originally was thinking about how, if my family was from Toronto and my father and my grandfather and my great grandmother, et cetera, existed in Toronto, the urban nature or the nature they experience outside their front door, we expect will have changed. And with climate change, we expect it to change even more, right? On the flag of the state of California is a bear that no longer exists in California. We love blue jays in Toronto. Will there be a time where we don't have blue jays in Toronto anymore? And so what we did is, if you look at the red dots, the further you are away from that dotted line, the more species you're going to lose. And in the blue, the further you are away from the line to the right, the more species you're going to gain through different climate change and socioeconomic scenarios. And here's Toronto. So we actually expect in Toronto, and if you actually look a little closer, it's all Canadian cities, mostly near the top. And we expect that in a lot of these cities, we will see actually a net increase in the number of species, but there will be some species we will lose. And we kind of mapped some of what those are. And I just wanted to make the point that in terms of bees, wasps, and ants, Hymenoptera, they're relatively static, right? But of course, there are many, many species of bees. And for any of you who've used iNaturalist, you know that identifying a bee to species on iNaturalist, et cetera, can be quite difficult. It's not all there. So the future looks okay for Toronto, but let's look at things right now, right? We have this urbanization gradient as I've described, and this is relatively easy to characterize using land cover data that are publicly available. But one thing that we think a lot about is the concept of heterogeneity, right? So in this scenario here, that center illustration, you can, maybe it's like the annex, you know, it's a very residential landscape. I could take two different places in the city, one that's maybe more industrial, and they have the exact same proportion of urban cover, but they are very different environments, right? Heterogeneity is quite different, right? In terms of the allocation, the contiguousness of the green space in those areas. And so we try to decouple or decompose in our analyses these effects of land cover type and the heterogeneity of that land cover. Now, one thing we've begun to do as well is actually map the three-dimensionality of Toronto. So we take what are called digital surface models, and we can actually map, these are based on LiDAR from the Government of Canada, and this is mapped for all of Canada, and we can actually map the building volumes, the building heights of our entire city. And just like we do when capturing urbanization around a particular site, we can now capture that proportion of elevation or amount of building volume to characterize the three-dimensionality of our environments. Now, you can only imagine buildings create shade, they increase wind for things like bees or birds. That aero conservation, the conservation of the air above us, is actually probably pretty significant. We just haven't really done this kind of work anywhere in the world. So one other feature, of course, is that of our urban green spaces in Toronto, there's a myriad of types, right? There's large parks, there's private gardens, you know, there's green roofs, right? There's a whole series of different kinds of habitats, and each of these, despite being connected or not, will contribute differently to habitat quality based on their management, the plant types, and so forth that characterize each of these. So we do a lot to try to characterize these habitats as well in our analyses. So again, I'm going to refer to green infrastructure as all the natural features, the remnant and restored green spaces that we find across our particular city. A good example of a really large remnant would be like Rouge Park, where there's that kind of habitat is characterized. We have restored habitat like the Meadowway. This is a 16-kilometer hydro corridor that runs from about Vic Park in Eglinton all the way to the Rouge National Urban Park. We do lots of research there with the Toronto Region and Conservation Authority to look at restoration age, plant mixtures, and management regimes like mowing and threshing and so forth to support different aspects of biodiversity. And of course, there are these constructed green infrastructure features, which are wholly created, right? They essentially puncture the urban matrix, right? Whereby we are inserting vegetation where there wasn't vegetation recently because of the massive amount of urban change that has occurred. So everything from green roofs, of which there are almost 1,000 permitted green roofs in Toronto today, green walls, much less common, but also street trees and pocket gardens and things like that. Okay, so kind of introduce some of the characteristics of Toronto that we're interested in, that 2D, 3D urbanization, the different qualities of green space. And one of the ways we characterize pollinator richness, abundance, fitness, interactions with flowers and parasites and so forth, are using these trap nests, these bee hotels. We've been using them for a number of years now, since my PhD days. Here are some of those Megachile campanula, those resin bees, making their nests right now. And as you see, multiple individuals working, every female is her own queen, right? She makes her own nests, collects her own food, lays her own eggs. Unlike social bees like bumblebees or honeybees, which again have a queen, workers, and drones. And they essentially, these ones are made out of cardboard paper tubes. They work pretty well. Just quickly before I get into some of the land use change impacts, we have done a few other curious things with these nest boxes. For example, when many of us are gardeners, or of course, all of us appreciate nature, and we often see these kind of semicircular cuts in the plants all around us, right? And it could be caterpillars, could be grasshoppers, whatever, but in many cases, at least in all the cases we've gathered here, this is from leaf cutter bees that collect leaves to create the brood cells that they insert inside of that nest that they're making in trap nests and plant stems and so forth. And what we did was use DNA barcoding to identify the leaves used by different leafcutter bee species in Toronto. And again, that list is right here. It's available in the paper. But what we found is that many studies in the past have focused on leafcutter bee activity inside of flight cages or in an agricultural landscape where alfalfa is the most dominant one, or sunflower and so forth. But in an urban environment where there's this wild array of different flower and plant options, there may be more flexibility than we realize when we actually take a little closer look. And we did find that some of these bee species were collecting, many different plants, upwards of, I think, 45 or so are listed here. What was interesting is a lot of these plants, we did a bit of a literature search, many of them have antimicrobial properties on the leaves. So could these leaves be providing some enhanced nesting condition for these bee larvae, which are susceptible to all kinds of bacteria and viruses and things like that? Using these trap nests, we've also found the occurrence of new bee species in Canada. Now, they're not new to science. These two bee species, Osmia cornifrons and Osmia taurus, they are used as managed pollinators, as I mentioned, in cherries and apples and other crops. But with the advent and growth of keeping cavity nesting bees in bee hotels and so forth, we're elevating or augmenting the number of habitat opportunities for these kinds of bees, which have become very dominant in the eastern United States. For example, our colleagues in Virginia did a study recently over a 14-year period, showed that this second bee, the Taurus mason bee, increased 800% in the 4-state study region. And this was occurring in concordance with the upwards of 90% decline of 6 native mason bee species. So we found the first one just a few years ago, and this map illustrates all the ones we found so far in Toronto. We're concerned, and we're also mainly concerned about the potential pathways by which this bee has arrived. And unfortunately, given the increase in interest in bee hotels, you can buy them at Home Depot and everything, Costco. You can go online and buy bee cocoons to seed your bee hotel. Now, this is a problem potentially because these cocoons all can look quite similar. And you may think you are supplying or purchasing a native mason bee, when in fact you may be accidentally introducing a new, possibly invasive one. And these two have arrived, and we've actually had them nesting in our trap nests. Of course, we didn't import them, but they are here. So we are worried about this and trying to think about how to improve the stringency of guidelines about permitted it or not release of bees, especially in cities and natural areas. So going back to these trap nests, we set them up all through the early 2010s, and then we have again in 2018 and onward throughout the city in different urban green space types, so we can capture some of those gradients, right? Those urban gradients. We do find variation in terms of what numbers of individuals, of richness and abundance occur in different urban green space types. So community gardens, private gardens can be quite popular. Parks, they're a bit more in terms of variety of parks, there's some that are mowed lawns for leisure and recreation. Others are more forested areas. So there's a lot of variation there. And then rooftops too, which was quite interesting. Again, many of these cavity nesting bees nest above the ground. So to find them nesting 2 stories, 4 stories, or 6 stories up was quite interesting. Now, one curious thing we did find in doing this work is we didn't find a strong effect of urbanization on bee communities using trap nests. Now, this goes against what that cities as a stressor might suggest, right? That bees would be expected to decline across an urban gradient. But what we in fact found was not a strong signature there, but that could be for a few reasons. One, cavity nesting bees are those that are often augmented in cities versus ground nesting bees. So not finding a strong signature in a group of bees that are generally expected to do better in cities versus not is interesting. As well, of course, we only use trap nests, these artificial structures to house the bees. And so we may be only collecting bees that already have a great deal of flexibility and willingness to exist in an urban environment. So there are some caveats there. But that said, there was some really interesting findings that we did have when we looked at the traits of the bees and wasps that nest in these trap nests. And what you see on this graph on the right here is the lines that indicate more urban or less urban indicate the relative importance in the trait score. So where those traits are more likely to cluster. So you can see at the bottom here, those wasps that collect, phytophagous insects like beetle larvae and caterpillars, they actually need more forested areas, right? Tree cover is negatively correlated with impervious surface. So, more larger, juicier creatures that are feeding on leaves, that, those wasps will be focusing on forests and trees and stuff. As you go up, there's different criteria. And the one I want to make the biggest point about was the nest secretions as being the most closely aligned with urban environments. Some bees collect leaves. Some bees collect mud. Some bees exude the nesting material. They secrete it based on the quality of their diet, right? So imagine you have a grocery list and it's long because you got leaves, you got mud, you got pollen and nectar and all kinds of other things. Some bees have very short lists, right? Food, that's it. Just go get food and I can make the nest myself. That may make you better prepared or able to live in an environment where resources are limited. So a few more things. As we mentioned, we've been talking or thinking a lot about 3-dimensionality of the urban landscape. And we did find, and we have shown, that there is this decoupling where there are some areas of the city where there's a lot of 2-dimensional pavement, but not a lot of 3-dimensional urban cover, right? So maybe industrial areas out towards the airport and so forth. Other areas of the city, there's a lot of 3-dimensional and less 2-dimensional, maybe around condos where they have to create parks to satisfy all the people living in a vertical environment. So there is this variation that we were able to capture. And that's illustrated in some of these figures here, where we have across the horizontal axes 2-dimensional urban cover, and on the vertical axes, total building volume, mean building elevation, and so forth. There's a lot of variation there. Now, when we took that trap nesting bee and wasp data set, and I mentioned that we didn't find strong signatures of urbanization when we look at it in 2 dimensions, we do find that species richness and Simpson's diversity inside of these trap nests declined with 3-dimensional urbanization. Okay, so this is an interesting quirk of that with this great growth in studies on urban environments. All of these studies characterize urbanization in 2 dimensions. And when we do it in 3 dimensions, we actually see a different pattern. So this is important for the future of this kind of work. So just before I end on some new research, I just want to point to some things that we've done focusing on constructed green infrastructure, mostly green roofs, but other places as well. And this is the Native Child and Family Service Center on College Street at Yonge. It's really beautiful. And it has many functions, but one that we tend to focus on, of course, in the lab is urban biodiversity. And we have done some work. This is from a meta-analysis where we looked at all the studies that looked at some measure of diversity, birds, arthropods, bats, etc., and compared to a constructed green infrastructure type to the conventional gray infrastructure control. So this is silly, but like looking at a green wall versus a brick wall and a green roof versus a bare roof, right? But we got to do these kinds of studies to make those important inferences, right? And what we show is that along the bottom here, this is the aggregated measure for all the studies, is that because that diamond shape is on the left side of that dotted line and it doesn't cross that line, that means that green infrastructure significantly supported biodiversity better than gray infrastructure. However, don't let those developers fool you. Constructed green infrastructure is not better than existing natural space, right? And we illustrate this with a few wild examples crisscrossing across this line, where we compare again green infrastructure to green analog, right? And we explain what those are there, but you can see this diamond shape is quite truncated and does not cross line on either side, meaning there's no significant difference there. Nevertheless, there are many other reasons which we don't need to get into about why natural green space or existing green space should never be replaced with a building with a green roof on it. That said, green roofs are interesting and they're the law in Toronto. And as I said, there's almost, and probably is, over 1,000 green roofs now in Toronto. I check the permit every few days, the permit's submitted every few days. And there's lots of reasons why green roofs may or may not be an important contributor to species, habitat, and opportunities in an urban environment. We've been looking in the lab mostly at the role of vegetation, the kinds of plants we grow in these things, how connected they are to other green spaces or the landscape use surrounding them, as I've alluded to already. But one thing we've been really focusing on in the lab, especially this summer, and I'll show you a few slides indicating some of the research directions we have now, is around temperature, right? We hear it in the news all the time, extreme heat events, they're increasing in number. Of course, the impact to people needing to seek respite in parks and green spaces to evade some of those extreme temperatures. You know, a lot of these extreme events impact biodiversity and species interactions as well, right? Our temperatures are determined by our metabolism, right? So when you know, our metabolism is not dependent on the external environment, whereas other creatures like insects or frogs are, right? So when it gets really hot, they slow down. When it gets really cold, they also slow down, whereas we may be able to endure a little bit more. So just before I get into that, I probably went too deep into it. I just want to mention a few things we have looked at, and that includes like building height. So when we send undergrad Shannon, our student, up onto green roofs at different heights, and she's collecting bees on different flowers, we see, of course, you see where the lines are going. They're going down with height, right? But what we do find is that when we interplant some of these green roofs with additional plants like Rudbeckia and other, you know, native, very tough and rugged flowering plants, we see these additional peaks in the availability of blooms, and that can greatly extend the habitat value of these spaces. So this big blue growth here is the timing of sedum flowering, succulents that are often used on green roofs. And we see this teal color as the Rudbeckia hirta flowers coming in afterwards. So we're seeing bees on a green roof when we normally wouldn't see them anymore because the flowers are all gone. We've also put up those bee hotels onto roofs with different heights, and we've also found the same kind of thing, right? This like decline in nesting activity. So in terms of creating green space in our city, I mean, because there's a green roof bylaw, even the next generation of 70, 80, 90-story condos being built in Toronto today, they're required to have a green roof on them, right? Why? It's too high. And of course, there's all kinds of ways around that, which we can talk about later. We don't need to get into now, but isolation in nature, as we've studied it in agricultural context and natural context, fragmentation, we cut down trees and there's this much distance between forest patches and so forth. This is horizontal fragmentation, right? In cities, we have this new feature, this vertical isolation, vertical fragmentation, right? And it could be the case that vertical is way worse or harder than horizontal. And we're really interested in asking these kinds of questions going forward too. Okay, so just to wrap that up, in terms of supporting bees in our city like Toronto, flowers, I mean, that's the best way. It's enjoyable for all of us, right? And understanding nesting materials, nesting locations, not just bee hotels, right? Many bees do nest in plant stems, leaving them as they are. You've probably been to talks where we talk all about like how to support the bees in your garden. I left that out today, but I'm happy to talk about it more. The surrounding landscape really does matter, right? So there are this myriad of urban green spaces, their connectivity, and the various limitations that are imposed by the urban footprint, both 2D and of course 3D, as we showed. And another important bit I mentioned is conserving remnant green space in cities, right? This is really important stuff. It's easy to go forward, but it's harder to go backwards, right? So we can pave over green space and put a green roof and a cistern underground, and the water's being captured better than it ever was. But there are features, that are critically important for biodiversity that are not captured when we think we can construct something. So again, I really love working in Toronto, and I just was saying I submitted my tenure application 2 weeks ago. So hopefully we can keep working in Toronto and thinking about a ravine strategy, our Toronto Green Standards, our Green Roof Bylaw, and all the other ways in which ecologists and scientists and those interested in natural history can play an important role in contributing to solving the big problems we face today and tomorrow. Like, it takes a multidisciplinary team to do that. And these are just some small examples, well, large in my mind, about how a city has attempted to do those things. So now just to last few slides, just some new research we've been working on. We're working in the Medaway, as I mentioned, which is this massive 16-kilometer hydro corridor. I highly recommend going out there. It's really great. And we've been studying different restoration ages. So from control, non-restored areas to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 year-old restorations, looking at the plant communities that are found there and the bees that are visiting them. And what we have found is that restoration age does matter quite a lot, where we find higher numbers of interactions, more bee species, including rare and interesting ones. We found one bee 2 years ago, Perdita, which is one of the smallest kinds of bees you can find anywhere in the world, as well as other kleptoparasites, bees that parasitize other bees that are good indicators of environmental quality. I mentioned we've been looking at extreme heat events, and so we have experiments where we artificially manipulate the surface temperatures of flowers using infrared heaters in the field. We have a portable setup. And we can heat the flowers up on one side and leave control flowers over here, and look simply at bee foraging preferences, both the number of bee species and the types that go to the heated or non-heated flowers on hot or not hot days. But we can also use an oil paint, mark individual bees, and watch for individual preferences. So these data we're working on now, but you can see there's quite a substantial amount of temperature differences that our student is capturing using our thermal camera. And this student was Charlotte Craig. She's a master's student working with us, really great student. The students' names I just have at the bottom, and I've been doing that through the talk, which I should have mentioned in the onset. But another student in our lab, John English, a PhD student, is working on how the urban heat island and extreme heat events might interact to affect plant pollinator interactions that are diurnal or nocturnal differently. Because the urban heat island effect, of course, causes this augmented heat dome in our city. And that makes the nighttime hot as well. And this may have different impacts on the activity timing, the diversity, or the number of floral visitors, depending on those factors. So we've just started building, we have built using what are called Raspberry Pis. They're a small computer, and we've been able to turn them into nocturnal motion detecting macro cameras. So we can mount them in the field on the flowers, and they collect motion detected images, 24-hour cycles. We can then use, we can take those images, build a training data set, and then use an algorithm to sort through all those photos and pull out the ones where there's an insect in it. And then we can identify it. Our other work is using drones. And of course, when we, as ecologists, we have to say something about habitat quality across the habitat we're serving bees in, but we can't count every single flower, right? We have to use subsets. So we take a 1 by 1 meter plot, we count the number of goldenrod, we count the number of New England aster, we count the number of smooth white aster, and we say, this is the habitat quality of the area. Not anymore. Now we can fly a drone over 100 meters by 100 meters, stitch together all the images. It's called an orthomosaic. We can build a training database by taking just a few of those tiles, hand drawing around every goldenrod, and then use that training database to compare across any drone images. So what we've been able to do now is take a huge swath of the Rouge Park, for example, and tell you how many goldenrods are in a 100 by 100 meter area, how many New England asters, how many smooth white asters, very quickly. It's really exciting, especially for us trying to figure out indicators of restoration success and how well things are going for us as we try to support biodiversity. We've also now started to use this work to track the movement of invasive species like dog strangling vine, which have a very unique signature as well. Lastly, we are really interested in understanding the role of people in conservation practice in the city. Of course, we map the urban footprint, but that doesn't necessarily track perfectly with population density. So for example, if I'm in High Park and I map High Park, and when I'm studying bees, it's very green. But we all know there are thousands of people in that park every day, right? It's not capturing population density. Urban footprint doesn't always do that perfectly. So we've started to work with anonymized mobility cell phone data from different companies that supply it for business practices. We can take parks before COVID, after COVID, anytime, and we can actually figure out numbers of visitors to a park, where they're going in the park. Are they staying on the trail? Are they going to certain features? Are they not going to certain areas? These can all be important real-time criteria for managing biodiversity. If I know where people are going and I'm biomonitoring for birds or bees, I can lay transects across this urban footprint. I don't know why this computer just turned off. So I'm just gonna wing it now. And just say that we're now working with these data across the city of Toronto to look at both location, abundance of people, as well as trajectory, so that we can improve the way that we plan parks, plan biodiversity in parks, and estimate park usage need, environmental justice and equitable park resource allocation across our city moving forward. So I'm glad that this is the last slide because this computer stopped working. So I'll just thank many people and all of you for attending. And I think I am okay for time, and I will answer any questions you have. Thank you so much. I'm not sure if we lost everybody. Oh, it's back. Great.
There's no questions in the chat.
Please.
The nest, the hole.
Yep.
So I'm able to tell the leaf cutters.
Yep.
But I also get a very, very dark gray cocoon, very smooth at one end, and a mushroom like at the other end. Is that a wasp?
It is a wasp, yeah. Now the wasp is called Tripoxylon. It's a spider collecting wasp. And you can imagine spider collecting wasps do fine in the city because there's so many spiders, right? Now, could you just tell me quickly the size? Is it like half a centimeter or is it like over a centimeter length? Oh, okay. So what you have is Tripoxylon lactitars, and it is a spider feeding wasp. Yeah. That's what it is.
Okay. These wasps, or the leaf cutter, and the leaf cutter.
They don't interact. They don't eat each other. They simply are looking for similar nesting resources. Now, Tropoxylon lactotarsus is not a super common nest box user. All of them, the leafcutter bees and the spider collecting wasps, they have a univoltine life cycle. So they'll all come out next year, right? So they're hunkered down for the winter now. They'll come out next year, but they'll come out at different times. And ultimately, they're really uninterested in interacting unless one is taking over the nest of the other, right? So good. That's a good find. Yeah. Thanks. Yes, please. Well, you're not entirely wrong with there are chemicals that flowers are emitting, like, we can smell a flower. There is chemical signatures that undoubtedly bees are cueing into. Bees are very visual, right? So like they don't see the flower, they don't see red flowers. They see red flowers as black, for example. But other colors like yellows and purples and blues and stuff are highly attractive and for different kinds of bees and so forth. So I don't know a lot about floral odors and chemistries and how those cues can attract. But bees, of course, are foraging, right? They are leaving the nest and they are looking for food, right? And once they find a good solid resource, they're going to keep going to that resource so long as the energetics that are required to get there and bring things back align with this like frantic rush that they're trying to get through so that they can make as many offspring as possible before they die. So, there's a very strong relationship between foraging distance, maximum foraging distance, and bee body size. So the bigger you are, the further you can forage. As well, if you're social and you're working on this team, to feed the team, you're willing to go further, right? So bumblebees and honeybees, for example, they go way further than solitary bees, for example. So those are some of the reasons why you may or may not find bees vertically on a rooftop. I mean, another factor, of course, that some bees specialize or benefit greatly from street trees, right? I mean, you plant flowers in a garden, that's great, but in one tree, there may be 1,000 flowers in one moment, right? So there is impetus for bees foraging this way because they got to get to the top of the tree, right? So we always think about this in the lab about how there are some cities that are built in very flat landscapes, like Regina, right? Versus like Boulder, Colorado, where the city is built in a very topographically heterogeneous environment. Could that be the context by which bees that live in a more vertically heterogeneous environment are more evolved to forage vertically versus, so if I put a tall building in Regina, would I get no bees? But if I put a tall building in Denver, would I get bees? Anyway. Yeah, over there. Huh. Repeat the question. Yeah, I'll just repeat the question. So are bees getting bolder? Because in your case, and of course the Rob Ford example, like things are coming closer to our faces and things like that. I would say no. It's simply like, personal experiences, right? That guide a lot of what we think and see. Like every year at the beginning of the year, I always hear people say, there's no bees this year. I'm like, well, this person says there's tons of bees this year. So it's very subjective in that way. The Rob Ford thing, yeah. And of course, at this time of year, that's one thing that you may notice that the paper wasps are really touchy with me right now. And it's because these wasps are usually collecting larval insects to feed their colony, and it's fall, right? There's not a lot of that out now, right? It's gone to bed. So now these wasps, which are particularly adapted to human environments, they can eat on a bologna sandwich and a pop, you know, they are much more willing in terms of searching for food. You know, there's something else that people often say is that among social bees and wasps at the later end of the season, the hold by which the queen has on her colony becomes more untenable, because like her delivery of pheromones and the communication becomes like less or more confusing. And that makes bees and wasps that are social a bit more like aggressive and like they don't know what they're doing. But again, I sometimes catch myself putting my mind in the mind of a bee, and I have to remember that we're very different. Yeah.
There's a question that you want to
yes.
read,
Rita, yeah, I see your question. And yes, we do. We work very closely with the city in environmental planning, on our parkland strategy, and of course, our green roof bylaw construction standard and the Toronto Green Standard. So yeah, they're very aware of these findings, and they're very agreeable to them, right? So, you know, like again, a very tall building may be required under the Toronto Green Standard to have a green roof on it, but they can actually pay out per square meter to not do the green roof. And that money will go to support a green roof somewhere else, like on a TTC building, on a museum, or some other city-owned property. So the money gets filtered out somewhere. And I often argue that, yeah, like after 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 stories, I mean, the real concern for energy loss and, you know, building cooling and warming and so forth is the walls and the windows. So thinking about green infrastructure as multi-pronged, and there being many ways to enact the services that green infrastructure provides, it doesn't always have to be a green roof. Yeah, I hope that answered your question. Yeah. Yes. Very good question. I mean, the one thing about cavity nests is they're pretty open and exposed, right? Whereas ground nesting bee nests can sometimes be covered, right, through time. There are lots of things that would predate on them, including ants, but my sense is they're structurally a lot more complicated for an organism to feed on. Like, for example, earwigs. Earwigs aren't necessarily eating, they might, but they're not necessarily predating upon bee larvae in a nest. They're simply looking for a nest for themselves, right? So you often find with bee hotels, like when an earwig's in there, they've just defecated so much, it's an absolute mess. And then it becomes, you know, not a healthy or a desirable environment for bees or wasp nests in there. Yeah, it's a good question. Like, you know, there are some work that has been done looking at like parasitism rates in ground nesting versus above ground nesting bees. And my sense is that cavity nesting bees are predated upon more. Yeah, yeah. Again, the other factor is that we know a lot more about cavity nesting bee predation and so forth. I don't think I actually repeated the question. I'm just realizing now too. Just quickly, sorry for those that are listening. The question was relating to the various predators that attack cavity nesting bees in bee hotels, and whether or not ground nesting bees succumb to similar amounts, or what are those predators that affect them. And my last point to what I will add there, Bruce, is that we know a lot more about the ecology, behavior, and diversity of cavity nesting bees for the reasons that we've already mentioned. We can create their nests. But ground nesting bees, there's just so much unknown about their. My old supervisor, Lawrence Packer, would always say, oh, you know, 75% of ground nesting bees, or 75% of bees nest in the ground, and 75% of those we don't know where they nest or what that nest looks like. So there's still a lot of work to be done there. I don't have a good answer. Yeah. Ooh, I don't know. I mean, there aren't, when I think of skunks, I think of grubs, right? Like big beetles and so forth. And the energy that it would take to dig out what would be, the size of my tiny fingernail larva, it may not be worth the effort. Nor may the skunk be able to sniff out where that particular nest is. So I'm not sure about that. But we do see things like woodpeckers and raccoons and other animals dismantling trap nests to get at the larvae. So again, when we create those trap nests, we're artificially aggregating these bees into a single place. Whereas if they were nesting in a natural setting in 3 dimensions, they may be far less aggregated and far less susceptible to parasites, predators, and things like that. Yeah, so I'm not sure about skunks. Again, many bees that nest in the ground are there are some big ones for sure, but some of them can be actually quite deep down underground, whereas a skunk searching for like a June beetle larvae needs to only dig an inch under the grass. Yeah, whereas some of those, as you saw, some of the nests for ground nesting bees could be quite deep. Yeah. Hmm. Hmm. Right. That's a really good question. So the question related to our work on extreme heat events. Well, what about colder or milder winter conditions and how that may or may not affect bee survival, diversity, and so forth? I mean, one thing I will say is ecologists often work in the spring, summer, fall, and not a ton of them do winter work. And that has to change. I don't want to lead it, but it does need to change. And there are some really great studies now looking at how colder or warmer or longer or shorter winters may act to decouple the synchrony of plants and the pollinators they visit or that visit them, right? So the predominant driver in spring for plants may be sun, light, whereas temperature would be guiding the maturation of bees in the ground or in a nest, right? They're not seeing the sun. And with climate change, these factors are, the expectation is these are being decoupled, right? Because with warming temperatures, we may see bees emerge earlier than the flowers have, or vice versa, depending on the situation. We have done some of that work with respect to mason bees and redbud trees and the timing of redbud. There's still a lot to do there. And I think few things. I want to go on a total digression, but I will just double back to your point about winter. Yes, so I mean, bees, like all insects, their hemolymph, their blood, has basically like an antifreeze, like a super cooling agent so that it never crystallizes. So a bee can be in a plant stem, up to here in snow and wind and everything, and it's just in its little sleeping bag waiting out the spring, right? So there is a lot of evolution and ability there for many insects to survive the winter here and further north, right? But it's more so about the timing, I think, is the issue with bees in terms of how strong or how light that winter is and how that may decouple those interactions. So we aren't working on that stuff right now, but there are lots of really cool labs thinking a lot about it. And I guess I'll say one last thing, and that is in thinking about those plant pollinator synchronies, that will matter a lot for specialist species, but it may not matter for a generalist where if I love redbud trees and there's also cherries, there's also this and that and the other, there's lots of resources that may improve the stability, the insurance of these environments, right? Yeah, I can keep going, but I'll end there. Yeah. Of course.
Yes, Thank you so much, Scott. Really, I think for many of us, you're taking us in so many different directions. The variables that need to be considered and that deserve to be considered. I wish I was 30 years younger and I could be in the lab and be a student. But it allows all of us to think about these things in our walks around the city, and I'm really glad that you are speaking to the city about these issues, because it sounds like we're not at the stage at the moment where we can set policy changes based on what you're saying right now, but we need to stay posted, don't we? Because you may very well be coming up with clear do's and don'ts, and we need to do those experiments. So I do want to thank you very much with a token of our thanks, and that is a copy of the book An Enduring Wilderness, which is a compilation of great photographs of Toronto's urban nature by Robert Burley. And thank you to the City of Toronto for having gifted the Toronto Field Naturalists with several copies of this. So thanks so much for being able to,
Thank you so much.
to share your experience with us.
That's great. Thank you.
And so, you also have the honor of one of our attendees today gets to take one home as well. And if you just choose the number, and this is the moment when you want to check your ticket and see what you've got.
Oh, the entire number? Okay, lots of digits here. 7 5 1 4 1 8 0 1. Ah! All right.
Okay, that is wonderful, and that really takes us almost to the very end of today's session. If you give me 1 minute to pass on along a little more information, because we have several TFN events that you won't want to miss that are coming up. We still have 7 excellent guided walks ahead of us this September, including one tomorrow morning to Lynn Shores. And the full list of walks is available on our website at the members only page. Remember that we no longer require pre-registration, and so you can just show up and you can bring a guest. I'll also give you a little bit of an advance warning that in mid-October, October 16, we will have a very special walk affiliated with the Bentway and Lost Rivers. So keep that in mind. Our next TFN lecture, our next TFN talk is on October 2nd, same time, same place. We'll learn about plastics pollution in the Great Lakes. And we're lucky to have Professor Chelsea Rochman. She's the assistant professor at U of T's Department of Ecology as our guest speaker. And this will be your last chance this year to bring your lunch beforehand, much like we did today, and catch up with other TFNers on the lawns outside. Looking ahead to November, our November 6th lecture will showcase restoring butterfly species in Southern Ontario. And we have Jessica Linton as our guest speaker. And Jessica Linton is a senior biologist at Toronto at Natural Resource Solutions Inc. in Waterloo. And her work on restoring the mottled dusky wing butterfly has been in the news in recent months, including in the Globe and Mail. And so this will be a Zoom only event because she's based in Waterloo. So thank you so much for your time and for coming down here. And feedback is always welcome. It's been our chance to really try a hybrid, and thank you for a wonderful, wonderful lecture, Scott. Thank you so much, everyone.